They were the faces of innocence, joy, and perfect family harmony. But behind the polished smiles and catchy theme song, fame was quietly chipping away at the foundation. As millions of fans celebrated the Partridge Family, one of its brightest stars was slowly breaking away, not out of pride, but out of pain. It shocked fans everywhere when Susan Dey refused to attend the Partridge Family reunion, all because of one co-star. The question lingered: who was it, and what really happened? In 1970, American television witnessed a seismic shift when Susan Dey, just 17 years old and a former model with almost no acting experience, landed the role of Laurie Partridge. Practically unknown at the time, she was suddenly thrust into the limelight. Her striking beauty and natural presence made her a standout from the start. She brought an effortless charm to Laurie Partridge that kept audiences coming back week after week. With her wide-eyed innocence and graceful presence, Susan quickly captured the hearts of viewers and was soon labeled America's sweetheart. Teen girls looked up to her for her seemingly effortless beauty and down-to-earth nature. Parents admired her wholesome persona. The Partridge Family, with their musical road trips aboard a brightly colored tour bus, became a sensation overnight. Merchandise featuring the show and Susan's face flew off store shelves. The songs from the show climbed the charts. Everyone wanted a piece of the Partridges. In a matter of months, Susan Dey was a household name. Her image was everywhere: magazine covers, posters, TV specials. She had the world's attention, but very few knew what was really going on behind those famous green eyes. Her rise to fame seemed like a dream, but in truth, it came with a cost. The public saw a radiant star. Behind the scenes, Susan was quietly dealing with the immense pressure of being America's newest obsession. As the expectations mounted, so did the emotional weight. She was supposed to be the perfect daughter, the perfect role model, but that version of Laurie Partridge was just a carefully maintained illusion. Behind the sparkle of Hollywood lights was a teenager struggling to keep up with the role everyone wanted her to play. While the Partridge Family painted a picture of endless laughter and musical harmony, life on set was far from ideal. The atmosphere, though cheerful on screen, was often tense and demanding. The young cast, especially, bore the brunt of fame's darker side. They were constantly watched, judged, and written about. Their childhoods became public property. Although the tabloids loved to speculate about behind-the-scenes drama, David Cassidy, Susan's co-star and the show's breakout idol, later claimed there were no major feuds among the cast. But not everything was as it seemed. Some tensions stayed hidden for years, only surfacing much later, long after the cameras stopped rolling. David Cassidy often insisted that the cast was like a real family. He spoke fondly of his close bonds with Shirley Jones, who played his mother, Danny Bonaduce, the lovable troublemaker of the group, and Susan Dey, who was more than just his on-screen sister. She was a trusted confidant. But no amount of affection could smooth over the complicated experience of growing up under constant public scrutiny. Beneath the glittering success of the show, the young cast, especially Susan, struggled with all the raw emotions of adolescence: confusion, attraction, and a persistent sense of loneliness fueled by the isolating glare of fame. Though she cherished her relationships with her co-stars, Susan later admitted that the whirlwind of popularity made it difficult to form authentic, lasting connections. Over time, the demands of fame and subtle personal shifts began to put distance between the once close-knit cast. The most delicate fracture was her relationship with David Cassidy. On camera, they played the perfect siblings. But behind the scenes, their dynamic grew increasingly tense. Both were rising stars with legions of devoted fans, and the spotlight seemed to shine especially bright on their every move. As Susan's popularity grew, David's fame took on a more intense, chaotic quality, becoming both a blessing and a burden. With the growing attention came comparisons and quiet rivalry. The challenge of separating their personal feelings from their public roles became harder by the day. Susan, introspective and thoughtful, often clashed with David's more outgoing and magnetic personality. As she began to feel suffocated by the expectation to constantly be Laurie Partridge, the space between them widened. There were moments of tension that played out in silence, awkward glances, unspoken disappointments, and private frustrations that never made it to the tabloids. But those moments were real, and they left their mark. Though never explosive, the disconnect between Susan and David simmered quietly beneath their chemistry, waiting to surface in later years when the glow of the show had faded. Despite all of it, Susan's image as Laurie Partridge remained a staple of American pop culture. She achieved a kind of legendary status, but the cost was steep. The real Susan, the young woman grappling with fame, identity, and heartbreak, was often lost behind the role she was expected to play. As the years passed and the show settled into TV history, Susan found herself holding on to something much more personal, an emotional thread tied to David Cassidy. What she felt for David wasn't just a fleeting teenage crush. It was more complex, deeper than most imagined, formed not just from proximity, but from shared experience and emotional connection. While fans screamed for David, and he basked in the glow of his teen idol status, Susan stood beside him, quietly holding feelings that grew stronger over time. She had seen the man beneath the fame. Between takes, in quiet conversations, and shared moments away from the cameras, her admiration deepened. But David, always conscious of his image and wary of anything that might complicate their working relationship, never allowed it to become more than friendship. The very premise of their show demanded a kind of innocence that didn't leave room for personal entanglements. Though David sometimes teased and flirted, he never crossed the line. He later admitted that he kept his emotional distance deliberately, aware that getting too close to Susan might damage the show's pristine image, and her, in the process. But that choice left Susan with a quiet ache, one she didn't know how to express. It was an emotional burden that lingered just beneath the surface. Though they shared laughter and friendship, Susan's deeper feelings were never returned in the way she'd hoped. There was no dramatic heartbreak, no grand rejection, only a quiet, lingering sense of what could have been. Over time, those feelings became something she buried deeply, hidden behind the graceful poise of her public image. She funneled that heartache into her performances, masking it with professionalism, even as it shaped much of her early adult life. Her bond with David, while never realized romantically, left an imprint that never fully faded. And as the years wore on, Susan sought distance, not just from the show, but from the part of her life forever entwined with Laurie Partridge and David Cassidy. Still, that quiet heartbreak remained with her. It never fully disappeared. As the Partridge Family era became a nostalgic memory, Susan began to reinvent herself, no longer defined by the sunny, musical teen she once played. She moved on to pursue more serious and respected roles, determined to carve out an identity on her own terms. David, meanwhile, found himself forever tethered to the past, even as he tried to move forward. For Susan, letting go of Laurie Partridge meant letting go of the feelings that had haunted her for years. But some stories, no matter how deeply buried, leave echoes that time alone can't erase. David Cassidy's career remained tethered to the legacy of his teen idol days, even as he wrestled with personal demons behind closed doors. In 2007, he decided to open up fully in his memoir, Could It Be Forever? The book offered a raw look at life at the height of his fame, detailing his complex relationships with co-stars, his whirlwind interactions with fans, and the inner chaos of being a cultural phenomenon. But amid the familiar anecdotes and confessions, one revelation hit harder than the rest, a moment that sent ripples through his readers and deeply unsettled those involved. Cassidy disclosed that during their time on the Partridge Family, he and Susan Dey had once spent the night together. The account was vague, more shadow than substance, but it hinted at something intimate, something that had clearly lingered in his memory. To him, it may have been a footnote. To Susan, it was a betrayal. It wasn't simply an anecdote from the past. It was a private, painful memory now exposed for public consumption. Susan had spent years trying to separate herself from her TV persona and the quiet wounds of her youth. She had walked away from Laurie Partridge, from the show, and from the aching silence that had long followed her complicated feelings for David. She had worked hard to build a life far removed from that glittery facade. But now, with a few printed lines in a memoir, a deeply personal chapter of her life had been broadcast to the world without her consent. Cassidy's revelation wasn't framed as a heartfelt confession or an olive branch. It read more like a glossy anecdote, tucked between tales of wild fame and backstage secrets. For Susan, the impact was shattering. It wasn't just about privacy, it was about trust, and the feeling that something sacred had been trivialized. It stripped that memory of its emotional weight and context, leaving only a tabloid version behind. Susan never issued a public statement. She didn't refute his claim or offer her own version of events. But her silence, pointed and resolute, was a message in itself. She never appeared on reunion shows, never commented in retrospectives, and never spoke about David again. For her, something had been broken, something that couldn't be repaired. That moment, once buried so deeply, had been dragged into the light. And with it, the last remaining tie between them was severed. The pain was too raw, the trust too shattered. For Susan, there was no going back. And so, she walked forward, quietly, but deliberately, away from the world that had defined her for so long. After the Partridge Family ended in 1974, Susan found herself at a crossroads. The world still saw her as Laurie Partridge, frozen in time with a guitar in hand and a smile on her face. But Susan wanted more than nostalgia. She wanted to be taken seriously as an actress, not forever confined to a single role from her youth. Her breakthrough came in the mid-1980s, when she landed the role of Grace Van Owen in LA Law, a bold, sharply written legal drama. Grace was everything Laurie was not: mature, intelligent, tough, and deeply human. It was a career-defining move, and Susan rose to the challenge with subtlety and power. The performance earned her critical praise and major awards, including a Golden Globe, finally validating her as a serious talent on her own terms. No longer just a relic of the past, Susan had evolved. She became a respected figure in the industry, known for her depth and restraint rather than bubbly nostalgia. But even as she moved on, the world didn't let go so easily. By the 1990s, a full-blown Partridge Family revival wave was in full swing. VH1 pushed for a reunion. ABC flirted with a comeback special. Fan clubs buzzed with speculation, demanding to see the family together again. The timing seemed perfect. The cast was mostly available. The appetite for nostalgia was ravenous. Fans begged for just one more performance, one more reunion photo, one more sing-along. But Susan stayed silent. No interviews, no cameos, no social media nods. Nothing. Her absence wasn't just noticeable, it was deafening. While other cast members entertained the idea of a reunion, Susan kept her distance. In an industry where revivals and reboots are common currency, her refusal to join in was striking. To her, the Partridge Family wasn't just a beloved sitcom. It was a deeply personal chapter, filled with early triumphs, painful growth, and private wounds. And by choosing silence, she wasn't rejecting the show entirely. She was reclaiming her story. For too long, her narrative had been shaped by scripts, gossip, and someone else's confessions. This time, she chose her own ending. Quiet, firm, and finally hers. It wasn't just about avoiding a reunion for the sake of nostalgia. It was about preserving her dignity, her privacy, and her peace of mind. The true reason behind Susan Dey's refusal to participate in any Partridge Family reunion was far more complex and deeply rooted than anyone initially realized. Insiders close to the production had long whispered about the real cause of her absence, and it all revolved around one person, David Cassidy. While many assumed her silence was due to personal choice or simple disinterest, those who knew Susan understood that her decision stemmed directly from the betrayal she felt at Cassidy's hands. The wound had festered over time, growing deeper with every passing year. This wasn't just a matter of old hurt feelings or forgotten memories from their youthful days on set. The betrayal went well beyond a romantic misunderstanding. It was personal. It was a violation of trust, an irreparable fracture in the fragile relationship they once shared. One former associate, speaking on the condition of anonymity, expressed the raw sentiment with brutal honesty: "He's an evil piece of shit." Those words carried a mix of anger, disappointment, and unresolved pain, a heaviness that lingered long after the Partridge Family had filmed its final episode. But it wasn't the pain of a failed romance that created this chasm. It wasn't the kind of hurt one might expect from unrequited love or a childhood crush gone wrong. No, the anger ran deeper. It was about trust. It was about privacy. It was about the line between them that was sacred, one Cassidy had unapologetically crossed and paraded for the entire world to see. The publication of David Cassidy's autobiography shattered Susan's world in ways no one could have predicted. In those pages, Cassidy casually mentioned a night they had spent together, a night that seemed trivial to him. But for Susan, it was a betrayal that exposed her in a way she could never undo. That deeply personal moment, once shared in confidence, had become public property, laid bare for the amusement and curiosity of fans. The vulnerability she had entrusted to him was exploited, and David never apologized for the pain he caused. The betrayal wasn't the physical encounter itself, but the way it was trivialized, reduced to mere fodder for his story. For Susan, attending any reunion would have been hypocrisy. It would have meant standing beside the very man who humiliated her in the most public way imaginable. To pretend everything was fine, to act as if the broken trust hadn't destroyed their bond, would have been to betray her own truth. So, Susan Dey chose silence. She chose absence. She chose integrity over the false pretense of a reunion. The road was harder, much harder, but in the end, she preserved her dignity. She had no desire to relive the past for anyone's sake, especially not for the man who had irreparably damaged what they once had. When David Cassidy passed away on November 21, 2017, the world was plunged into a wave of nostalgia and grief. For millions, David Cassidy was forever the charming teen idol from the Partridge Family, the heartthrob who captured the hearts of teenagers and parents alike. Fans worldwide took to social media to express their sorrow, flooding timelines with tributes, photos, and heartfelt messages. He was remembered not just for his fame, but for the joy he brought into the homes of his admirers. But amid the collective mourning, one silence stood out, a silence that spoke volumes. Susan Dey, the actress who had once shared the screen with Cassidy as his sister Laurie Partridge, offered no public words of tribute, no tear-filled interviews, no acknowledgement of the loss. Her silence was deafening. There was no grand gesture of mourning or reflection. It wasn't an oversight or unresolved bitterness. It was a deliberate choice, a final act of self-preservation. Susan had long avoided revisiting a past that, for all its sparkle, had been marred by personal betrayals and private heartbreak. She chose to grieve in her own way, on her own terms, far from cameras and public gaze. While others rallied together to celebrate David's life, Susan retreated into quiet solitude, protecting the boundaries she had fought so hard to maintain. Boundaries that David Cassidy himself had crossed, whether unknowingly or carelessly, in ways that still haunted her. As the years passed, the dream of a Partridge Family reunion lived on in fans' hearts. Rumors swirled, official attempts were made, specials and documentaries produced. Fans clamored for the moment when the Partridge Family would reunite, standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling in perfect harmony just like in the 70s. But time moved on, and that reunion remained elusive. Though glimpses of the cast appeared in television specials and anniversary events, the one reunion everyone hoped for, the full family back together, never came to be. Susan Dey's absence was always noted. She chose not to participate, standing apart from the nostalgic waves that swept through her former co-stars. Some speculated about why she stayed away when others embraced the spotlight. But for Susan, the answer was clear. She had never been interested in living in the past, especially when that past had so often been a place of pain. To her, the Partridge Family was a chapter long closed. The show's legacy, its fandom, and reunion projects only served as reminders of a time that had never fully healed, a time when her personal suffering was glossed over for the sake of entertainment. Her decision wasn't a rejection of the love fans showed, but a quiet statement: some wounds are not meant to be reopened. They are better left where they ended, behind closed doors, tucked away in the quiet corners of memory. Susan Dey's message was subtle but powerful. Not all reunions are meant to happen. Some stories are better left untold, some memories too painful to revisit. Her refusal to return to the spotlight wasn't denial of the past, but an affirmation of personal peace. She built a life far from the echoes of former fame, a life where she controlled her own story. In a world obsessed with nostalgia and perfect reunions, Susan Dey reminds us that sometimes the greatest lesson is knowing when to leave the past exactly where it belongs, in the past. Have you ever been betrayed by someone revealing one of your secrets? How would you have felt if it happened on such a huge public scale? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.